Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to come here today and give this talk to you. I really look forward to it. I appreciate your time, and I hope I'll give you some really interesting things to think about as we go through here in terms of, well, what I think is maybe the central challenge of formative learning. So let's just kind of jump right into it. So, of course, when we think of formative learning, it sounds beautiful, and it is beautiful when it works. The whole idea is for anybody, be it a student, be it somebody who's working within their career context, they can ask themselves, where would I like to be? Where am I going? What's the goal state that I currently have? Where am I now? And how do I get from here to there? So what do I need to work on to get to where I want to be? And of course, a key component of this learning is, of course, feedback. So the idea here, a central idea, is that we're not always very good at looking at ourselves and seeing our strengths and weaknesses, especially our weaknesses. We may have trouble seeing the weaknesses in our own work. There's that famous phrase, you don't know what you don't know. And so if you're doing something wrong, but you don't know about that, you don't see it. And so quite often we rely on somebody else to look at our work and to be our eyes for us, in a sense, to see those things we could do better and to let us know. And that is feedback. And, when described in that way, it sounds like a really nice thing. We're all helping each other. We're sharing advice about, how we can be better. But is it always a good thing? Let me start you off with this example I like to give every now and then. Imagine you are going to some important function and your significant other is going with you. And as they come down to leave, you don't really agree with the way they've dressed. You think it might not be appropriate for the function. What do you do? Do you do anything? I think many of us would just choose to, what we call, bite our tongue, not say anything. If you do choose to say something, you're probably going to word your what you say very carefully. You're probably going to know, oh, I have to be careful about how I criticize right now, because it's likely to cause an emotional reaction in that other person. I'm likely to make them unhappy. That is the key point I want to talk about today, how feedback can trigger a negative emotional reaction and get in the way of learning and what we can do about it. So specifically, I will call this the anxiety response. It's really just reflects a basic component of our biology that, when we feel like there's a threat of some sort, our body goes into what we're going to call fight or flight mode. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And I'm going to suggest that feedback is in fact perceived often as a threat. And so it can trigger this response. And when it does, it can interfere with learning. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And then finally, we will get to the sort of main point here of, well, what can we do about it as educators? If we want to embrace this idea of a formative culture, where people are giving each other feedback and using that feedback to improve, what can we do to create this culture so that it works? And in fact, there is a fear, a worry that if you don't take the time to think about this, the culture you create will not work. And I'll tell you why. So that's the goal. By the end of this, hopefully you'll say, okay, here's some things we can work on to really ensure that this approach works for us. All right, so let's start with the first part. What is the anxiety response? A little bit of quick, bring you back to your biology class here. Back in the day, back when we were living a sort of cave person existence, much of what we did was focused on our long-term survival. It was about, creating tools so we could hunt, gathering food, and that all gives us the nutrition to sustain us, finding shelter, finding water, etc. Keep ourselves alive for the long term. But every now and then, as we were trying to do that, some threat appeared, some existential threat, some threat that could end our life. And it turns out our biology has things set up so that we can enter a special mode when that happens to really deal with this threat and survive. So it's all about short-term survival. So let me just walk you through that really quickly. It turns out that all of our brains have these structures in the limbic system that are all about short-term survival. The thalamus helps direct attention, and all the input from the world goes through the thalamus. The amygdala is analyzing that input. It's like our spider senses. If it senses danger, threat in the environment, then it flips a little switch on our body. Okay, so now let me explain to you what this sort of switch does. Our brain has a way of interacting with our body. It's called the peripheral nervous system. And it has two ways, two sort of modes, two ways of being. When we're worried about long-term survival, when we're just walking around the bushes, picking our fruit, and just enjoying ourselves and feeling relaxed, what our body is doing is really focusing on digestion. So it's what we call upregulating those parts of our biology that deal with digestion. These are things like salivation, so we have more water in our mouth, our stomach gets active, our gallbladder gets active, our intestines are active. Essentially, by the way, our heart rate slows, our breathing slows, and our pupils constrict. So we're kind of relaxing, we're kind of turning off from the world, slowing down everything, and our body is worried about taking that food that we ate, separating the nutrients from the waste, eliminating the waste, and delivering the nutrients to the body. Okay, this is long-term survival. So there we are, going through, picking our berries, relaxing, enjoying the sunshine, everything's beautiful, and our body is in this mode. When suddenly we hear or see or smell something that says, hey, there's a predator here. There's a danger to your existence. So we could, if we want to be saber-toothed tiger, let's say, whatever it might be, a bear, there is something there, our brain detects it and it flips the switch. And we immediately move from this mode, long-term survival, to this one, short-term survival. Now, this other mode, which we'll call the fight or flee mode, is almost in every way the opposite of the relaxation mode. So quite literally, all of those organs that were involved in digestion, they now slow down or turn off. It's kind of like the body's like, digestion doesn't matter right now. There's a predator out there. And so what does happen is your heart rate speeds up. Your breathing speeds up. What this is doing is pumping oxygen-rich blood through your whole body, and it's making you really strong. And so you're ready to do something. Even your eyes dilate. In fact, all of your senses become more aware. You're more tuned into the world. And basically, you feel like you need to do something, and that do something seems to boil down to those two words, fight or flee. You either take on that predator directly or you get the heck out of there. Either way, you have this almost super strength to do it, to either fight or to flee. This is the strongest and most powerful you are when that short-term survival switch gets flipped. Okay? Now, there's some effects that I'm going to emphasize throughout this talk, and we'll talk about these two. When this mode kicks in, this fight or flight mode, there is less blood flow to your frontal lobes. The frontal lobes is where we do all of our rational thinking, our planning, our strategizing, our reflecting. And so when we're talking about somebody, say, learning from feedback, this is the part of the brain that learns. This is the part of the brain that changes the way it behaves in light of rewards and punishments and things like that. So if we want people to learn from feedback, we need this part of the brain. And when they feel like they're under threat, this part of the brain is not at its best. It has less blood, less able to do its thing. The part of the brain that is sort of at its best is the limbic system, that part that I showed you right in the middle, which is very primitive, an old part of our brain, and it's worried about short-term survival. It's kicked in this fight or flee response. The other thing I want you to understand is this is the part of the brain very related to emotion. And so it's also producing an emotional reaction to this. Often it would be fear, right? If it's a predator, for example, some sort of negative emotional reaction. And so we have, when we're in this situation, we're not thinking really well, and we're very strong and emotional and we want to fight or flee. That seems to be the formula that has kept us alive as we've dealt with predators. The problem is it's not only for predators. Now let's just be positive first and say, by the way, this system does have value even in the current world. Here's a context we sometimes hear about it. Let's imagine this police officer was walking down the road, heard a commotion, came around the corner and saw, let's say, a child trapped under that car. Their fight or flee reflex kicks in. They know they have to do something, and maybe they go over and grab the car and lift it so that somebody can remove the child. And people would say, how can this woman lift a car? That's a very, very heavy car. Normally, she would not be able to lift it. But when she's in this fight or flee mode, she has the strength and she's able to lift, much to the shock of these people over here, she's able to lift this car. Kind of cool. That's what it's meant to do. That's the purpose of that fight or flee system, is to allow us to kind of short term get powerful to deal with situations like that. Okay, cool. So yeah, it's a regular response, it's biological response. It's just a reflection of our survival mode, and it has evolved to deal with these sudden acute threats like bears. I'm actually not going to talk about this chronic thing. We're going to leave that for another day, but let's keep here, because the critical point for today's talk is that yes, bears trigger this, but so too does feedback. Feedback doesn't seem scary like a bear seems, but it is. If somebody is pointing out, especially if it's critical feedback, if they're pointing out weaknesses or flaws or things we're not doing very well, that can feel to us like we're being attacked. They're highlighting negative characteristics of us, and we don't like that. That doesn't feel very good. That feels almost like an attack. That's the point I really want to kind of stress. So we would like to think thoughts like this. We would like to think that every student is just saying, please tell me all the ways I can improve. I really want to know, and that every coworker and every manager and everybody in our system is just waiting for someone to point out ways they can be better. That's just not human. But we want to get people here. And that's going to be the question. How do we get people here? The reality is very different, of course. And here's just a taste of that reality, just one research paper that I wanted to highlight that suggests that, students actually, when they get feedback, tend to react with a negative emotional response, not with a thank you for telling me where I can improve. And in fact, some of the research is particularly scary because it seems to be, let me just read this underlined part, for students who received grades lower than they expected. So let's just think about this for a second. These are students who do not currently have a good understanding of their strengths and weaknesses. They thought they did pretty well, but they got lower than they expected on a particular assessment task. Those students were more likely than students who received grades higher than they expected to feel sad, shameful, and angry as a result of the feedback comments. Sad, shameful, angry. Those are very negative emotions. And so this student who has had some of their flaws revealed feels these negative comments. And these are the students, of course, that have the most potential growth, right? The students who are not doing well and don't even understand that they're not doing well, those are the students that could benefit the most from feedback that could help them improve. Those are the coworkers that could benefit the most, etc. But those are the people that feel, in fact, the most threatened by the feedback. So this is a problem. If we just allow these negative emotions around feedback to exist, it's going to be a bit of a problem on a number of levels. So first of all, let's just return to this and think about it. It's a challenge. If the person is feeling that negative emotional state, they have trouble thinking about the feedback in detail because their frontal lobes are compromised. And in fact, they tend to react to it in this emotional way, like they would react to something that was a threat to them. So they tend to have these negative emotional reactions. What's the impact of this? Well, First of all, it can make it very hard for them to actually hear the message, the central message. So we have the emotion, and then we have what this person said about how I could improve. But if the emotion is dominating, I'm first of all not even going to hear much of what was said. I'm going to only hear a little bit of that. And what I'm actually going to absorb is even less still. So first point is that the emotion is getting in the way of that learning. It's almost like a bouncer standing in front saying, you will not learn because you must pay attention to me. And that's not good. We have to find a way of getting the emotion away so that people can do the learning. The other reason that we must do this is that these emotional associations can make the whole experience negative. People can start to say, I don't like this feedback thing. Every time I get feedback, I feel angry, sad, shameful. For example, I would just rather not get feedback. And so suddenly the people may get a negative association with feedback in general, and therefore with formative learning. So again, if we allow these negative emotions to kind of win, then our attempts to build a formative culture may be doomed. We may actually be creating a group of people who really dislike this formative approach. And maybe some of you have seen that already. So what do we do? How do we get from that negative reaction? What can we do to train people to learn how to learn from feedback? And that's what I'm going to suggest, will be the focus. Learning from feedback. I hope you got this from this point. It is not natural. It's not what we naturally do. That's okay. Playing guitar is not natural. Dancing well is not natural. There are all sorts of skills in this world that are not natural. But if people take the time to learn them in a structured way, then they gain that skill and they can do something a lot of other people don't do well. For all of us and for our students, if we can learn how to learn from feedback, if we can overcome this emotional response, we can have a great advantage in life over all of those who don't. And that's one of the messages that I think we need to deliver to the students and to what I'm trying to deliver to all of you as well, is this goal of teaching students how to learn from feedback and teaching each other how to learn from feedback is a very powerful goal. And if we reach it, we are really giving these people a tool that they can use for personal growth and success. Okay, so it's worth thinking this through and finding ways of addressing this challenge. Okay, I just throw this slide up only to say, a lot of people have thought about feedback and what makes feedback, especially good. And there's a whole bunch of qualities we could talk about. I'm going to focus on number one. The first step of learning from feedback effectively is to actually engage with the feedback. In fact, a lot of research has shown that over 50% of students don't even read the feedback they receive. Those are the fleers. And some of those who read the feedback, all they're trying to do is find out why they think it's wrong. Those are the fighters. They're fighting it. We want to breed a different kind of mindset. We want to breed this sort of Carol Dweck mindset, this growth mindset that she talks about. We want students to feel like when they're getting feedback, hey, this is an opportunity for me to learn ways I can grow, rather than this is a person who's attacking me. How do we get from that attack to the growth mindset? What can we actually do to support the development of a growth mindset? Carol Dweck talks a lot about the language we use, and that's very important. And you'll see some of that reflected in what I do as well. But I also think we need to really scaffold this. We need to take, I'll call them students, but I actually mean anybody who's trying to learn from feedback. We need to take them a little by the hand and walk them through the process of learning from feedback. How do we do that explicitly? How do we take them from fight or flight to sit and think? That is a major challenge. and it's one I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So I'm going to show you what I think and what I do to give you a solid thing. Now, what I do will be focused at the student level. That's just where most of my work is. But I think whatever I mention will apply at the professor/teacher level, at the school level, and maybe even at the board level. I think we're going to be able to extend some of the principles I tell you about to these levels. But again, I'm going to focus here on the student level. And so let me now just flip over here. And what I want to do here is just give you, I'll start here, a very concrete example. So I use something called Peer Scholar. It's a technology that we created in my lab, and we created it specifically to exercise a bunch of these transferable skills: critical thinking, creative thinking, communication, collaboration, etc. But we really rely on feedback heavily. So this is a very formative process, as you'll see. And we've really taken seriously this idea of scaffolding the feedback giving and receiving process. So let me just walk through this very quickly to give you a sense. It's a 3-step process. In the first step, I begin, first of all, by explaining to students that the goal that we have in everything we're doing here is to develop their skills, and that developing skills works differently than does developing information or learning information. Let me just give you a taste. I'll just jump in here a little bit to give you a taste of what this feels like.
And that's partly because
I'm not even sure
learning skills is a very different...
Actually, I believe you can't hear that. I now understand because I have these in. So at any rate, you can just
process
see
from learning information. In fact,
on the screen
our
here.
brain learns
That I'm talking to them about the underlying psychology of learning. I'm making them understand why we're going to ask them to do what we're going to ask them to do, and how it should benefit them. So I think that's really important. First of all, information makes students aware of why we're doing what we're doing. That's really great. And so now we just give them some task. And in this case, the task was just go to YouTube, find a commercial, and pitch it. Okay, so I'm talking about how do you make a pitch good. And so they're trying to pitch this ad as though it was one that they created. That's their task. Their task can be anything you ask them to do. That's the task here. Okay, so they would go ahead and they would do that. They would put in a video here and they would pitch it. Then they would come back, and here's the important next step. I'll show you the instructions in just a second, but just so you have a sense, their task is going to be to look at the work submitted by a bunch of peers. Notice we have about 5 of them. Normally there would be the work here. It's not there because there's no work right now. This is just the setup. But they would go peer by peer. They would read that peer's work. They could comment directly on the work, but then they would fill out this assessment form on the right. And the assessment form could even include things like a rubric about, was this a good pitch? So they could actually score the pitch that they saw based on a rubric of what makes for a good pitch. But they are also asked to give some positive feedback to this person and to give them some constructive feedback. Now, notice if we go back to Carol Dweck for a second, the way I write this is very growth mindset. It is really like, hey, we're here to help each other improve and grow, and you have to give constructive feedback. And I even mention a little bit what that should look like. So, remember, good constructive feedback is authentic, future-focused, and goal-oriented. Be direct and honest, but make sure you specify a clear point that can be improved. So I'm giving them some coaching here, but before they ever even get here, they go through the instructions. And this is what I mean by scaffolding. In these instructions, I first say, hey, we're going to ask you to do peer assessment. We're going to ask you to assess peers. Here's why. Here's what it'll do for you if you do this well. And so I give them a little bit of a video to motivate them. But then critically, I say, okay, so what you're going to have to do is give feedback to your peers. What does that mean? What does good feedback look like? Now, if you go on YouTube or the internet in general and search for the qualities of good feedback, you will find all sorts of people telling you, here's 5 characteristics of good feedback, or 4 characteristics, or 8 characteristics. Look at those, find one you like and agree with, And then maybe shoot your own video where you describe to your students, you know, here's what I mean when I say give feedback. This is what good feedback should look like. Here are the characteristics. So let's teach them how to give feedback. Now, this is going to be part of my recommendation, that in order to teach someone how to learn from feedback, let's first have them give it. Let's first have them be on this giving feedback side so they learn how challenging it can be. Because that'll help when they're getting feedback to understand, yeah, I know that person probably had some difficulty telling me about my weakness. I remember what that was like. It's not easy. So that if they're a little inelegant in how they word things, maybe the person will understand because they've been in that position. Okay. And we also go a little further and say, hey, you're also going to do self-assessment. So here's why we're asking you to do this. Here's what the benefit of that is. So again, a little bit of micro-learning to kind of take them by the hand so that when they come in here and start giving feedback, they know what that means. They know what you're expecting of them. And we're also really structuring their process by asking them to answer specific questions. So we're kind of guiding them through an analysis of the work, and this is where all the critical thinking and creative thinking happens, and then ultimately asking them to give feedback. You just learned about it, now do it. And then, by the way, do it again for peer 2, and do it again for peer 3, do it again, and do it again. This is the sort of repeated practice that will make somebody a good feedback giver. Okay. All of which is almost set up for the most important step of the process, which is the third step. So in the third step, they would then be seeing their composition. And as they click on each peer, what changes is the feedback the peer gave to them. So there would normally be a bunch of feedback written under here, and they can go and read this feedback. Now again, quite often we give people feedback and it just stops there, right? But here we're going to say, no, it's not going to stop there. We're going to force you, that's force is such a strong word. We're going to strongly encourage you to read through that feedback carefully. How are we going to do that? Once again, we're going to ask you some questions about the feedback. You're going to have to go through and answer a bunch of questions that we ask. Now, what I'm modeling here, these can be any questions that you want, but what I'm modeling here is literally the process of teaching students about this emotional reaction and kind of saying, hey, when you read that feedback, originally it probably made you feel emotional in some way. And so go ahead and note, like maybe it made this person anxious and frustrated and a little dumb. They felt a little dumb after they read the feedback. Whatever they say, they do this for two purposes. One, it goes back to the person that gave the feedback. So you get to see the reaction your feedback caused in others, which is, you know, a good learning cue. Feedback on your feedback. But the other big reason is to teach students, yeah, you know what? That emotion is the bouncer. He's standing there trying to prevent you from learning. Look them in the eye and say, yeah, I see you. I see you anger. I see you frustration. But you know what? Now that I've seen you, out of the way. Okay, let me get on to what really matters now, which is how useful this feedback was in terms of helping me improve. So we're trying to model to students this step of acknowledging the emotion, but then getting past it and getting to the actual content of the feedback. And so that's something we can sort of show them a little bit. We can also, by the way, use a rubric, some sort of feedback rubric, and ask them to actually score the feedback. This is really cool because we can actually quantify how good a given student is at giving feedback, because they give feedback to, say, 5 peers and they all score them. And so we can get a score, you know, for Steve. How good is Steve at giving feedback right now, at least in terms of how the peers reacted to it. And so we can actually measure some of these, which is a real other kind of cool characteristic. The important point, though, for this is we're making them think about it. You know, we're not allowing them to fight it. We're not allowing them to flee it. We're saying, no, sit, think. You know, get rid of the emotions early, get on to the rational part, and really engage with this work and try to understand what that peer is suggesting to you. And by the way, when you do all that for the first peer, do it again for the next one. the next bit of feedback, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next. So again, repeated practice, really engaging with feedback. That's the first thing they really need to be able to do. Once they do that, once they have engaged with the feedback from 5 of their peers, the next thing that's very important to do is say, okay, right now, while it's all fresh in your mind, use that feedback to make your work better. That's the goal here. And so we might show them what they originally submitted and say, there's your original submission. 5 people have now recommended ways you could improve that. Go ahead and improve it. Make it better. Take that feedback and use it to create a better version of your composition. And that's the one that we will then send to the teacher. This is powerful because this is where students get the payoff for all the emotional discomfort. This is when they say, oh yeah, you know what? It's better. As I read this now, it's better. It improved. So yeah, I wasn't comfortable having some of these flaws pointed out, but now that I see them and I fix them, I'm going to get a better mark from this. It was worth it. This is the payoff. And so you may ask, I would recommend that you ask them to do that too, to revise right away in light of the feedback. So what have we done? We've gone from just giving them feedback and saying, okay, go away, figure it out. And we've said, no, we're going to give you practice with feedback from different people, analyzing that feedback, thinking about it, and then actively using whatever things you agreed with. You don't have to follow what everybody says just because they said it. You just have to think about it. That's what we're encouraging here. And if they see that this is all worthwhile, then that becomes the reward. And if they go through this process repeatedly over and over and over again, they are going to start to see the value that comes from learning from feedback. They will also, by the way, have a smaller emotional reaction. They will start to get, we can call it a thicker skin, but they'll start to get the sense that, okay, this is how feedback works. There's always that emotional thing, and I go, ugh, whatever. But then I put that aside and I get down to it. And, this becomes a skill. This becomes a habit for them with repeated use. Okay, so let me now jump back here. So what am I suggesting? Well, that we take those things that we're doing with the student and we now think about them on a larger scale. So if I were going to make larger recommendations for sort of how to build a formative culture, a successful formative culture, step 1, knowledge. Just like I did for you here today, let your students understand that you're trying to teach them a very useful skill that will give them a huge advantage, but that this skill will be a challenge to learn because of their emotional reactions. Let them know that happens. By the way, an interesting idea came up in a presentation of this, which was, what if you had a little box up front and you allowed students to give you feedback as a teacher anonymously? They could put in notes. And what if at the beginning of every class you pulled one of those out and you said, okay, somebody thinks I should do the following? That might annoy you, and you can show them that. So my first reaction to this is, I'm upset by this. I'm angry. Okay, so you can model this and say, okay, yeah, I feel it. I feel that annoyance. Okay, now let me try to put that aside and let me get to the actual heart of what this person is suggesting, and let me reflect on that and think about it. And you can think about it out loud. You don't have to agree with the feedback, but modeling that process for them could be very important, and highlighting the connection to things like the emotional reaction could be really cool. The other thing I highlighted with students, and that I would recommend more generally, is don't just have somebody in a position where they're constantly receiving feedback but not giving it. In fact, I would prefer that they give some feedback before they receive, but at least make sure they're on both sides of that, because their experience when they give teaches them how challenging it is to give good constructive feedback. And that's what they can carry with them when they're now receiving. They can understand the challenge of the giver. And that helps them be a little more accepting as a receiver. That, sometimes it's hard to word things in ways that don't cause emotional reactions, for example. So by putting them on both sides of that, they're getting the full picture of what feedback can do and how it comes about. And so I highly recommend that. And mostly, of course, when we are at the point where they're receiving feedback, especially constructive feedback, don't just give it to them and let them walk away. Ask them to do something with that feedback. At the very least, you know, they could, if it was in a sort of collegial situation, you could say, could you please send me an email? Or maybe we plan a meeting in the future to follow up from this. Sometimes it's not good to talk about feedback right away, right after the person received it, because they're having that emotional reaction. So you might let them walk away and send you an email later about the feedback and what their thoughts were, or to come back later after they've had a time to kind of deal with the emotions and they're ready to be rational. But literally say, I want you to dig into this a little bit, and I want you to show me that you did dig into it. The other thing I would say here is, when you see somebody who does embrace the feedback, if you give somebody some feedback, you should consider doing X, I think. And then you see them doing X, celebrate it. Thank them. Say, wow, I noticed that you're now doing whatever, which is what I suggested, which is very, very cool. Thank you for listening to what I had to say. Thank you for embracing it. I really appreciate it. You know, really kind of give that extra. They probably know they're improved already, but if you can hit it with that extra little social reward, fantastic. Yeah. You know, those are the general categories of things I would say. Make sure you have a lot of understanding and knowledge about the challenges of receiving feedback. Make sure they give feedback as well as receive, and then really try to help them as they digest the feedback in ways that will get them to engage with it, think about it, and then hopefully grow. Okay, so that's largely my talk for today. Again, just wanted you to understand this response, that's a very primitive response that we can all have when we feel like we're being attacked. I want you to understand that feedback can generate that response. In fact, it usually does, especially critical feedback that's pointing out a weakness, but that we can use knowledge and experience. We can have people literally learn the skill of getting past the emotional reaction, but it is a skill and it requires support during learning. So we have to give students as much support as we can in terms of, telling them exactly what we want them to do, giving them a sense ahead of time of the reaction they may have and why, and then helping them get past that reaction, and mostly giving them repeated practice, because that's how the skill develops. And that's how we get to somebody who is that kid with the open arms. Tell me how I can be better. That's the process. So I want to thank you all very much for your time. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk to colleagues all over the world. So thank you for this opportunity. I really hope you have a great time at your conference. And yeah, I will see you next time. There will be a few questions, I believe, that may follow here. So yeah, let's move to that then. Thanks. Bye-bye.